The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth as Rade slipped the silk blindfold over Kakke's eyes. "Come with me," he whispered, his breath warm against Kakke's ear. "I have a surprise for you." Kakke shivered, not from the cold, but from anticipation. Rade had always been full of surprises, sweeping him off his feet in ways no one ever had. Their love was the kind that felt stolen from a novel: secret meetings, whispered promises, and a passion so intense it bordered on unreal. 6 months ago, Kakke never would have imagined this. He had always been cautious with his heart, wary of giving too much, too fast. But Rade was different. He was confident, magnetic, and impossible to resist. He made Kakke feel seen, wanted, chosen. Even now, as Rade led him deeper into the unknown, Kakke felt no fear, only trust. "Are we almost there?" he asked, his voice light with amusement. He could hear the leaves crunch beneath their footsteps, feel the uneven terrain shift under his boots. Rade chuckled. "Patience. You'll love it, I promise." And Kakke believed him. They had spent countless nights dreaming about the future, where they would live, the places they would travel, how they would prove to the world that their love was unshakable. Rade had told him once, under a sky littered with stars, "No matter what happens, I will never hurt you." It had been a vow, a promise that Kakke held onto tightly, even now, as the air grew colder and the night stretched darker. Something about the forest felt different tonight. He could hear the wind whispering through the trees, a low, eerie hum that curled around them like unseen fingers. But Rade's hand in his own was steady, reassuring. "You trust me, don't you?" Rade asked suddenly, his voice softer than before. Kakke smiled, squeezing his hand. "Of course I do." Rade exhaled, a sound too measured, too careful. And yet, Kakke ignored the flicker of unease creeping up his spine. Ahead, the forest thickened, swallowing them whole. The city lights had long since disappeared, leaving them in a world of shadows and silence. The air was dense now, charged with something unspoken. Still, Kakke held onto the fantasy, because love was trust, wasn't it? And Rade had never given him a reason to doubt. Had he? A rustle in the distance made him pause, but before he could question it, Rade stopped. "We're here," Rade murmured, releasing his hand. Kakke felt the warmth leave his skin, the sudden absence unsettling. For the first time that night, doubt crept in. The blindfold remained in place, and Kakke's heart quickened. "Can I take it off now?" he asked, but Rade didn't answer right away. And when he did, there was something different in his tone. "Not yet." Kakke swallowed. The air felt heavier now. Something was wrong. The blindfold remained in place, thick and unyielding against Kakke's skin. He could hear the forest now, the distant rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig. The air had changed. It was no longer crisp and inviting but damp, heavy with something unspoken. "Rade?" Kakke's voice wavered slightly, though he forced a chuckle. "You're making me nervous." Rade didn't respond right away. Instead, Kakke felt a shift in the air, as if Rade had stepped back, putting space between them. The warmth of his presence was suddenly distant, like a receding tide. "You trust me, don't you?" Rade's voice was quiet, almost hesitant. Kakke's fingers twitched at his sides. The question felt different now, weighted with an urgency he didn't understand. He nodded, forcing his lips into a smile. "Of course I do." Silence stretched between them, thick and uneasy. Then, finally, Rade exhaled. "Good." Kakke expected Rade to remove the blindfold, to let him in on the grand surprise. But instead, he heard footsteps, soft, deliberate. They weren't coming closer. They were moving away. Kakke's pulse quickened. Where are you going? No response. His chest tightened. Rade. He reached out, but his fingers grasped only air. Panic flickered at the edges of his mind. The world behind the blindfold was absolute darkness, pressing in on him. He hadn't realized how much he depended on Rade's presence, his voice, his touch. Without it, the forest felt vast, unfamiliar. Then suddenly a sound, a rustling, a whisper, but not from Rade. Someone else was here. Kakke's breath caught. He yanked at the blindfold, fingers fumbling in his urgency. The fabric was tight, knotted at the back of his head, refusing to budge. His pulse pounded against his ribs as his hands scrambled to undo the knot. And then, a hand touched his shoulder. He flinched, a sharp gasp escaping his lips. But before he could react, Rade's fingers brushed against his. "Relax," Rade murmured, his voice close again. "You're safe." Kakke let out a breath, but it felt hollow. Something was wrong. He could feel it in the way Rade's touch lingered just a moment too long, in the way his voice didn't quite hold the warmth it usually did. "Just a little longer," Rade said, but it didn't sound like reassurance. It sounded like a delay. Kakke swallowed hard. His instincts screamed at him, clawing at the trust he had built brick by brick. Then, finally, Rade's hands were on the blindfold, untying it. The fabric loosened, slipped away. Kakke blinked against the sudden darkness, not of the blindfold, but of the night. And then he saw it, the firelight flickering in the distance, the figures standing in the shadows. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows against the trees. Figures loomed in the darkness, their outlines barely distinguishable from the shifting glow. Kakke's breath hitched. His fingers curled involuntarily, seeking Rade's hand, but Rade had already stepped away. A chill licked at his skin. "Rade," Kakke's voice was barely above a whisper. "What is this?" For a moment, Rade didn't answer. He stood still, watching Kakke with an expression Kakke couldn't read. Was it guilt? Hesitation? Or something far worse? Then, finally, he spoke. "Kakke, I need to tell you something." The weight in his voice made Kakke's stomach drop. "Tell me what?" Rade exhaled, looking past him, toward the shadowed figures. "You weren't supposed to find out like this." Kakke's pulse hammered. His feet felt cemented to the forest floor, though every nerve in his body screamed for him to run. "Find out what?" he demanded, his voice breaking. Rade's eyes finally met his, and what Kakke saw there shattered him. This wasn't love. This wasn't a romantic surprise. This was something else. A cruel game. A deception so deep, so intricately woven, that Kakke had never even questioned it. "You were a bet," Rade said finally, the words cutting through the night like a blade. "A dare." Kakke's breath left him in a sharp exhale. His mind struggled to process, to make sense of something that should have been impossible. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "That's not true." His voice cracked. "You said you loved me." Rade didn't flinch. "I said what I needed to say." The world tilted. Kakke's heartbeat roared in his ears. The past 6 months flashed before him in fractured images. Every late-night confession, every whispered promise, every stolen moment of tenderness. None of it had been real. His chest ached with a pain so sharp it felt physical. "So this was all just a joke to you?" Rade looked away. "It wasn't personal." "Not personal." Kakke let out a hollow laugh, but it caught in his throat. His hands trembled. "It was personal to me." The figures in the distance shifted. Someone chuckled. The sound made Kakke's skin crawl. He was surrounded.
trapped.
For the first time, he truly saw what this was. This wasn't just about heartbreak. This wasn't just about betrayal. This was danger. Something was coming, something worse than the truth. Kakke forced himself to move, his legs shaky beneath him. "I'm leaving." His voice was steel, but Rade's next words sent ice through his veins. "You're not going anywhere."
Kakke turned.
Rade's expression had changed. The boy he had loved was gone. In his place stood someone else entirely. Someone Kakke didn't recognize. Kakke's breath came in short, uneven bursts. The air felt suffocating, thick with betrayal and something far more dangerous: intent. Rade no longer looked like the man Kakke had fallen for. His expression was unreadable, cold, detached. The shadows behind him shifted as the figures moved closer. A murmur of voices, laughter, anticipation, sent a shiver down Kakke's spine. This wasn't just about humiliation. This was about control. And Kakke refused to be a pawn any longer. He took a step back, forcing his body to remain steady even as his pulse thundered. "I'm leaving," he repeated, his voice sharper this time. Rade's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Are you?" Kakke didn't wait for an answer. He turned on his heel and ran. The forest exploded with movement behind him, footsteps pounding, voices shouting. They were chasing him. The cold air sliced against his skin as he tore through the trees, dodging low-hanging branches and uneven ground. Panic clawed at his chest, but he forced himself to focus. He needed to be smart. He needed to get out. A root jutted out of the earth, catching his foot. He stumbled, nearly falling, but caught himself at the last second. He couldn't afford to be slow. Not now. Then light. Faint but real. A road. Hope surged through him. He pushed forward, his lungs burning, legs screaming. A car. Headlights approaching in the distance. He ran faster, waving his arms, desperate. "Help! Please!" His voice cracked, raw with terror. The vehicle slowed. Behind him, the footsteps hesitated. They weren't going to follow him onto the road. They had wanted control, but not exposure. Kakke reached the pavement just as the car came to a stop. The driver, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, rolled down the window. "What the hell?" "Please," Kakke gasped, barely able to speak. "I need to get out of here." One look at his face, and the driver didn't hesitate. "Get in." Kakke scrambled inside, slamming the door shut. His hands shook as he turned to look back. The forest was still. The figures had melted into the darkness, as if they had never been there at all. But Rade was still watching. Standing at the tree line, his face shadowed, unreadable. Kakke met his gaze one last time. Then the car pulled away, the forest shrinking in the rearview mirror. His body ached. His heart felt shattered, raw. But he was alive. And he would never make the mistake of trusting blind devotion again. The night might have stolen his love, but it hadn't stolen his future. That he would reclaim for himself.